Erin Clarke is the rector of St. Matthew's Bethnal Green, a writer, priest, theologian, and eternal optimist. And in this workshop, we're very blessed to have two responders to the book and to Erin's words. We have insights from Meredith Gunderson, London-based yogi, curator, artist, and mystic, who studies and teaches spiritual practices to bring us more fully into our authentic selves. And we have Dumaeza Nhlapo, who is a Zulu Southern African, guys is a Londoner, who has done a lot of youth work, led a church plant, and is an ordinand at St. George in the East in Shadwell. Three people with lots of urban experiences and a love for finding sacred spaces in the city. And then, of course, there's all of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you wherever you are. Whatever you bring, we are really happy that you are with us. There'll be a time for questions and answers and bringing your own stories and comments after the three presenters have spoken. So do be typing into the chat your questions and responses, and I'll come to you one by one to unmute. If you could remain on mute until that moment, that would be fantastic, and it would help our recording of this session, which will be available on the Heart Edge Facebook page after this event. We aim to finish by 3:30. And just before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words about Heart Edge for those of you who are new this afternoon. Heart Edge is an ecumenical international movement for renewal in the church, for the broad church. It's a place to connect, to be resourced, and to share ideas for mission around the 4 C's of commerce, compassion, culture, and congregational renewal. What does that mean in practice? Well, we run lots of Zoom workshops around those 4 C's to help resource you, to help stimulate thinking and sharing. We have a sermon preparation workshop every Tuesday afternoon, practitioner group every Wednesday afternoon where we study an academic book, or we share as well insights from ministry and support one another. And we operate across the USA, Australia, South Africa, Europe, and right across the UK. So do join our movement if you are interested to do so. Just before I hand over to dear friends, Erin, Meredith, and Dumaeza, I would like to just share a short film with Sam Wells talking about the 4 C's.
Heart Edge is a group of people who believe in living God's future now. We talk about mission through the 4 C's. The first C is commerce. We believe by engaging in business activities, the church can enormously broaden the number of people with whom it comes into contact. But also it has the chance to model what it believes by the way it employs people and the kind of activities it does and the way it does those activities. The second C is compassion. If we want to come face to face with Christ, we need to go to the places and find the people in whom the Holy Spirit makes Christ present. So compassion isn't an act of pity for those worse off than ourselves. It's an act of worship in which we intend to come face to face with Christ. The third C is culture. We believe churches can become like estuaries, where the salt water of the church can meet the river water of the world, and gathering around artifacts or compositions that invoke the imagination, church and world can interact and find beautiful things in common and create wonderful things together. And finally, congregation is the 4th C. We believe God is giving the church everything it needs for this generation. But if we're going to receive everything that the Holy Spirit is giving us, we need to unearth the energy that the church has too often neglected, whether that's in the talents and gifts of disabled people, or perhaps what an asylum seeker is bringing to a congregation from their own culture, or maybe what a person with dementia or their carer is longing to give and to say and to participate in. Too often the church has neglected those and many other such gifts that God is giving us. We believe that the church will be renewed if we receive those gifts. Heart Edge is about a humbler church and a bigger God. We very much hope that you'll join us on this quest together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Ben. And this time of pandemic has been such an opportunity to discover new energy and new corners of our own neighbourhoods as we are all walking and praying and enjoying the outdoor spaces in our local neighbourhoods, perhaps for the first time, not flying to the other side of the world. So on that, I would like to hand over to Erin Clarke, author of Sacred Pavement, a do-it-yourself guide to spirituality in the city. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Kath. Oh, look, people are applauding. This is weird. Hello, everybody. Hello to those of you who I already know and to those of you who I have not yet met. As Kath said, my name is Erin and I'm the rector of St. Matthew's in Bethnal Green. That's an E2 for you Londoners. You'll notice I don't sound like a Cockney, and that's because I was born and raised in the Midwest of the States, the bit that's next to Canada. So I've been here coming up on, 15 years or so. So my accent goes all over the place, for which I make no apology, really. So have fun with that. Yeah, I wrote a book for many reasons, but the first impetus for writing this book was a rant stroke argument. And I've really come to believe in the spiritual import of rants stroke arguments. At least for someone with my personality, it tends to bring out often what is most true in a moment. And that moment, that rant, that argument, which was the beginning of the Sacred Pavement idea, was one which I was having with a friend of mine who I didn't know was in publishing about what I perceived in the world to be an overemphasis on escape, whether that was amongst people of faith and kind of established faith traditions, talking about getting away on retreat, or whether that was the much broader kind of spirituality industry. It to me seemed like there was, everywhere you turned and looked, there was an invitation to just leave it all, to get away, preferably somewhere beautiful, rural, up the side of a mountain, or maybe go to Bali or anything. The idea was you needed to get out of your normal. And that's how you would be able to grow and develop in your spiritual path. And don't get me wrong, I love a good retreat. I have some nuns in Kent of whom I am very, very fond, and try to get there on my retreat as often as I can. But it just struck me that there was an imbalance here. There was too much of this, get out of your space. And so often this seemed to be something which was aimed at urban dwellers, people who were facing the pressures of urban life. So I proceeded to rant at my friend about this for a little while on a call. And he said to me, "Oh, can you write a book about that?" And I said, "Of course I can." And he said, "Well, if you want to, I think I could probably hook you up." And then I had to write the book. So I did. And when it came down to writing it, I wrote it before the start of COVID-19, but of course was moving towards the space of getting it actually published and out in the world after the pandemic began. And so I was suddenly confronted with this question of what do you do as an urban dweller when you don't have the option of escape, when it's not just making a choice about staying, remaining, digging deep in the place where you are put at the moment. But what about when that is just simply not an option? What about when some more of your choices are taken away from you? And I don't think today we'll only be reflecting on themes of what our spiritual walk has been during the pandemic, but it's certainly been something that I know is on my mind and the minds of Meredith and Dumaeza. in the last year. So before I invite Meredith and Dumaeza to speak a bit, what I'm hoping that we can do today is each of us three, myself, Meredith, and Dumaeza, will just speak a bit about the cities in which we have spent some of our lives and the ways in which those specific cities with their specific spiritual gifts, we might say, have been our teachers, have taught us ways of being and praying and breathing that we might not otherwise have known had we not made that choice to remain and to dig deep into those specific urban places. What have we learned about our practices of faith and spirituality, and indeed even about God in those specific cities? So each of us will be speaking directly to our own experience, first of all, and then I'll give you a little book sneak peek. And after that, Meredith, Dumaeza, and I will have a little bit of a chat about some of the themes that maybe came up out of that. And you're very much invited at that point when we are having our chat back and forth to just start dropping questions, either in the chat or you can raise a hand. And I think, Kath, will you call on people when they ask questions? Yeah. So if you'd like to ask a question or bring something up, please do after I've read my little bit from the book. Love to hear maybe from you about some of the cities which you have called home, how they have helped and challenged you in your journeys of faith and spirituality over your life. Before we get going, I have one more thank you to say. I think I've seen that both Kate and Bishop Joanne are on the call. Bishop Joanne was very, very kindly willing to write the foreword for me for the book. So if you buy it for no other reason, buy it for her words. And Kate, who is the director of Creators of Peace International, very kindly blurbed it as well. So I didn't want us to get any further without saying thank you very much to both of you for supporting this project. Right, who wants to go first? Meredith or Dumaeza? Which one of you wants to have your urban ramble first? Or do you want me to pick one of you? Dumaeza, go.
So I am Dumaeza. I'm Southern African. I grew up in Soweto, so was born and raised in Soweto. I was born in 1984. Those of you who know your history and your South African history, when I was 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as the first Black president of South Africa. So I was kind of born in that transition when the South Africa that was and the one that is still not yet, actually, even today, but was sort of starting to come into view. So I grew up in the townships in Soweto, but because of my mom's job, she works for Anglo-American mining company. I ended up, as a Black South African who lived in the township, going to one of probably the most prestigious private schools at the time in, coming up end of the 80s, but as the charity case. And it was very clear, like I was the poor township kid who was there as a charity case. So grew up in two different worlds, really. There was school where, it was like the first Black dermatologist, the first Black this, and then old white elites who were wealthy, as well as the newly Black wealthy. And then there was there was a couple of us. I wasn't the only kind of charity case, but that was kind of my upbringing in between two worlds. And that made me a hybrid. I always, and my family speak of me as a hybrid. You kind of learn to navigate these two worlds and translate them to each other. And also more negatively, you learn how to stay safe in each world. Because you inhabit this world, you are seen as a threat, or this world can become sort of threatening to you. So you need to learn how to move in certain ways. So I guess the perception or the awareness of different spaces and being a hybrid, that's kind of been a really important thing in my life. And that's continued even as a Londoner. I'm married to Janet Marie, who's from North Devon. So I'm married to a white blonde Brit. Our kids are hybrid, a beautiful blend of the two of us. So yeah, in terms of the cities, Soweto, which is a couple of million people, and then that sits within Johannesburg. And I went to school in the northern suburbs in what were white-only schools, but now as the politics was changing, they were called multiracial or Model C schools, but everything was pretty much, it was built for it was built for the 70s, and it felt like it. So our teachers, everything, there was just a sense of oppression, and that your full self, who you were, your family, the way they did things, it wasn't welcome when you were at school. Literally, our hair was policed. So the way my hair grows out of my scalp was a detentionable offense. You would have to like go to the hair salon and pay money to contort your hair to be something. So you kind of grew up with these things, these senses of, oh man, the way God has made me is not acceptable over here. And ironically or interestingly, those were also Christian spaces, which you can imagine what that does for your idea of God and who God is and what he thinks about you and your personhood. So that's kind of early childhood. Hang on, how long am I going for here, Erin?
You've got a few more minutes, don't worry about it. You're doing good.
All right, I'll pause on that. So basically grew up in that kind of environment. Fast forward to about 16, I came to faith. I was raised by my grandmother who loved Jesus, but for me, I was always a God-fearer, but not a Christian in that sense. But when I was about 16, I came to faith. I feel like I tripped over God's foot, and then it took me about 18 months to figure out what he had done. Like he just made me alive, and it took me a while to kind of discover what had happened to me. The first big break, I dropped out of school in my final year of school and went to Germany on a cultural exchange program. So I spent a year in Germany, and that was literally the first time I'd been anywhere other than Soweto, Johannesburg, and Lesotho, where my mom's people lived. Went to Germany, culture shock, insane, everything. But loved it. And that was kind of like my first taste of Europe. And that kind of led to me coming here to the UK to do a youth work diploma. Met Janet Marie down in North Devon, got married in 2007. We moved to London in 2008 to do youth work here in London. So I've been here in London since then. And I've kind of come to the Anglican Church via Baptist and Assemblies of God, and at one point a Baptist church that I had an Assemblies of God minister. And those two would probably be like the biggest imprint of discipleship on my life. And then had a stint at New Frontiers where we planted a church, which I led for a couple of years. And then over the last 3 or 4 years, just felt God calling me to the Anglican Church, and was like, what is that about? And then feeling called and drawn to ordination. And I'm a first year ordinand, 6 months into my ordination training. And yeah, I will pause there.
Thanks, Dumaeza. Meredith, do you want to have a little mini bio moment?
Yeah, sure. Erin, I can't tell you how interesting it's been to think about this question that you posed just the other day when we were on the phone, of thinking about the cities that we've lived in and how they've affected our spiritual journey. I've never thought of that before. Like, I definitely see myself as someone who doesn't struggle to find a spiritual life in a city. I love cities, but to have this sort of time and space to reflect on the impact of the different cities that I've lived in on my spiritual life has been such a gift, actually. So I love it. I love this conversation. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, which is in upstate New York, right on the border of Canada. And I lived sort of what we would call kind of downtown in the city. And Buffalo is one of these Rust Belt cities. And at the time when I was growing up, it was, there were a lot more, white people living in the suburbs rather than, we're kind of unusual that we lived in the city. So I was in a very diverse, I was encountering people that were different than me a lot where I lived in the city. And I felt that, and I think that rub and that sort of child experience of diversity made me more curious about other people, made me more curious about myself. And I think that has played a role in terms of, I don't know, it possibly expands when you're curious, it expands possibility and compassion. So I think that definitely played a also, my mother decided, I mean, she grew up Catholic, like really good girl Catholic. And when she called to organize my baptism, the priest said, "Are you planning on bringing your child to church every Sunday?" And she said, "Well, you know, probably not every Sunday." And the priest said, "Well, then why bother getting her baptized?" And my mother, who's actually a very nice person and doesn't usually have tantrums with strangers, hung up the phone. And my older brothers were baptized, and everyone I knew was either Jewish or Protestant or Catholic. So like you were saying, Dumaeza, that this hybrid, like not knowing where you fit, I think that from a very young age, again, this made me more curious, like what is this religion thing that I'm on the outside of, and feeling like an outsider, I think really made me more curious about, like, when going to church with my friends, going to people's bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs, I was quite captivated and curious about that. So I think that those are sort of key things when I was, and also we grew up in the city, but then in Buffalo, a lot of people move to Canada in the summertime and live like a completely different rural life on the lakes. We live on the Great Lakes. So you're only like a half an hour away from your house in the city, but it's a completely different world, different pace of life, and very much very rural. So I had that contrast that did make me appreciate both things. And then I went to university in Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder is, you know, I wouldn't say new agey, but it's really, I mean, there's a university, I didn't go to the university, but there's a university there called Nhlapo University that was founded by a Tibetan monk, for instance. And like some of my friends went there, and I just loved how we sat on zafus rather than chairs and sat around and talked. And, you know, Boulder does have this kind of liberated kind of quality to it. There's this connection with beat culture, and it's a small city, but it has a very distinctive personality. And again, there's this probing curiosity and people trying different things and alternative lifestyles and asking questions. And it's a little bit of a place that people kind of go to sort of drop out a little bit. There's it's maybe a bit less so now, but it has a feeling of experimentation there. And both growing up in Buffalo and also when I was in Boulder, you know, my favorite places, my background is in the arts, and my favorite places to go were museums. And this is where, I mean, I absolutely recognize this is like sacred experiences now. But this is where I would go and I would see things and feel less alone and feel connected through culture, through the visual arts. And the proximity to these kinds of museums as well, quite interested in the theater and music, like all of it, played a huge role in shaping me. And I do feel like that's very much tied to my own spiritual journey as well, and the way that I encounter mystery. And also while I was at university, I was lucky. I had some really interesting tutors, and there was an experimental filmmaker called Stan Brackage. And again, it was this encounter with mysterious work. He used to do weekly screenings and talks for people, and just everyone would rock up. They were totally free. And he held space for experimentation, for beauty, for asking questions. And I think that was really, really formative for me. And his spirit was so generous in terms of sharing his work and sharing himself. So I then moved to Denver. And at that point, I was interested in time-based artwork. So I was doing a lot of producing of events, sort of like rave sort of things, which meant a lot to me on a human level, on a, you know, this artistic side of things. And you can do so much artistically in cities because everyone's there and there's all these resources and energy. These events, these sort of raves, if you will, and time-based artworks and performance pieces and stuff that I was involved in, they were absolutely linked to me questioning what it means to be a human being, thinking about who we are and why we're here, and connecting with other people while doing that. And I lived right downtown in Denver. One of my best friends and neighbors was the director at the Colorado Ballet. There was, just all kinds of culture on offer. I moved to Edinburgh. My husband is Scottish, and I moved to Edinburgh in 2001. And it was a huge kind of leap of faith, sort of maybe courageous, maybe arrogant, to kind of think that I could drop into this city and feel sort of at home. What really I felt very very much like an outsider and very kind of unwanted in some ways. And there are two particular places in Edinburgh that I went to really soothe my soul. And one I just happened upon, which is St. Margaret's Chapel at Edinburgh Castle, which I found out later is the oldest building in Edinburgh. And there's like some really old stuff there. So this is a super old building, but it's this very, very simple chapel. It was built in the 1100s. And the atmosphere is so specific and so beautiful and so quiet and so soothing. And the fact that it's just sort of, well, you have to pay to go into the castle, but that so many people are wandering in and out of it, and it still retained this really special atmosphere. I had an extremely sort of religious moment in that chapel at a time when I felt very disoriented and wasn't sure about my place in the world. I remember being in that chapel and having a very profound feeling, and I wanted to learn about who is Saint Margaret and so on, and that somehow connected me. And reading about other people's experiences and understanding that other people suffer and other people have pain, and then this guy decides to make this chapel for his mother, like just the whole tumultuousness of life. It helped me to find like some inner calm. And also I used to go to the portrait gallery and read about it in Edinburgh, and it's free. So in the States, our museums are not free. You have to pay to go in. So I like completely loved the fact that we could go into these museums for free. And going into the portrait gallery at a time that was really difficult, I see these big portraits of people, and then I read, these like tiny little, this person's life in 20 lines, and it's full of drama and full of all kinds of stuff. And I was like, I would look at this and feel like I'm not the only person who's had a bad day. I'm not the only person who's had a hard time. And that really meant a lot to me. And then when we moved down to London is a challenging place to live, but I love it. And I think that there are, enormous possibility. I mean, as we encounter people, we're encountering, God. Not to oversimplify, but we see what people do, we see what they produce, the art that they produce, the culture that they produce, the buildings that they build. And I feel a big connection to people being in the city and seeing what they get up to, and how they grapple with life, and how they go to church or not, and what's important to them. I also find that the Thames is a very useful thing running through the city, that everything stops for this river. We can't build on. I mean, we can put bridges, but we have this tide coming in and out. I find the Thames really, really helpful and beautiful, and a contemplative thing for me. But London is intense, and sometimes you're encountered with a lot of suffering, and what kind of capacity we have for that is tough. It's tough to expand that, and I've definitely found that during the pandemic. Yeah, I mean, I've also lived in Cambridge and in the Hebrides, but I think, is that enough?
Sorry, trying to
Hope
figure out if
that's
I'm mute or
helpful.
not. That's great, Meredith. Thanks to both of you. I've just was kind of scribbling notes and like circling things as you both would use the same word or reflect on something that kind of touched on what the other had said. I think there's yeah, Dumaeza, you talked about being really aware of your own kind of hybrid identity from very young, and that being something that being in Soweto, but also then the travel that your later life brought you, it's like the hybridity got more and more complex. And I mean, Meredith, you spoke about that, almost sort of saying you felt a bit arrogant that you'd be able to drop into Edinburgh and just become a hybrid, just like that. And I think that maybe developing one's own hybridity, or the sort of multiple different aspects of identity, whether that's expressed in terms of what spiritual communities we seek, or just how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we connect with what's really important. I think perhaps that's one of the things which urban dwelling brings out just automatically in us, because we're encountering so much difference on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, Dumaeza, I forgot that you lived in Germany. Where did you live? Were you in the middle of nowhere? Were you in Berlin or somewhere else?
No, I was just outside of Düsseldorf. It was a little town called Velbert, but
Okay.
kind of played in Düsseldorf and Essen,
Yeah.
so on the Rhine. Yeah.
Those are like kind of German Rust Belt cities?
I mean, I don't know what.
Were they big kind of post-industrial, or were they kind of humming with industry?
Düsseldorf, I guess, would be, but like the town I was in, where I spent most of my time, it was a little town. It didn't feel, I was having kind of city withdrawals in that sense, culture shock and city withdrawals. That's why I hung out in Düsseldorf a lot of the time.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I think something that possibly Meredith and I share is this relation to kind of the crumbling city as well as the thriving city. So Buffalo, which Meredith spoke about, I lived in for a while as well. And there are many cities along not just the American Midwest, but different places in the world that have sort of had their boom and are now in their bust in terms of the industry that's been there for a long time, and how we as urban dwellers relate to cities that might be a little bit past it or recovering themselves. We'll all know places in cities where we currently live or where we have lived before that feel a bit like, oh, the buzz has gone out of this. Where has it gone?
And shame. People feel, it's an interesting thing to be able to hold.
Yeah. And I think one of the things which I spend some time reflecting on in the book is what to do with the sense of abandonment in cities, and how does encountering what is not loved or not as loved as it once was, what does that do to us? How do we spend time in those kind of liminal spaces when we're unsure about what is the use of that space? And how does that help us to reflect on those spaces in us, which maybe we haven't inhabited for a while, or we feel shame or confusion about, or we don't know what the point of that bit of us is. One of the things that my husband said when he read the draft of this book is he said, "This is an extrovert's book on spirituality," which, for those of you who know me, you will laugh at that because you'll know I'm very extroverted. But I suppose that something about being a person of faith who has lived in a couple of different cities, both some of these kind of Rust Belty places in the States and then moving over here to London, one of the things I found was this question of what does it mean to be a person of faith, a person trying to live out her spirituality when so much of that happens externally to me? So I'm such a crap meditator. Sorry, Meredith. I really need to take your course. But so much of my life of prayer and meditation is really, really, it was really about connecting to what's outside of me. It's really about who I meet. I mean, I think you both touched a little bit on connecting with God as God meets you in other people, and different people who are very different to you in different places. And so one of the things which I think cities really challenge us to do is to hold in tension this desire to go within, to know that, you know, the Spirit of God absolutely meets us within, and to go out and to step outside our front door, to do so with intention, to do so with patience, to do so with courage, and some common sense, and to expect and know and hope that maybe the same Spirit which meets us when we're being calm in that little corner of our home somewhere can meet us in the chance encounters that we have, or the abandoned spaces that we meet. But I think maybe it's more challenging to think about how we do that in cities than in the country, when it's just everything's gorgeous. Look at that beautiful lake there. Doesn't that really just sing the goodness of God, that beautiful lake next to that mountain? I'm going to do a little bit of reading in a second about kind of encountering architecture and ugliness, but I'm wondering if before we get there, if Meredith and Dumaeza, both of you guys could share something truly beautiful which has impacted the way that you pray, or that you are before Spirit in the city, something that just bowled you over with its beauty, surprised you in how it jumped on you with its beauty and made you want to pray or rejoice.
Does it have to be beauty, or can it also be knocked over by ugliness?
It can be ugliness.
That takes you to the same.
Yeah, do it.
Same thing, really.
Do it.
Yeah,
and ugliness.
For me, one of the, I almost find it panic attack inducing. Standing at the in Canary Wharf at the top of the big escalators at rush hour, when you just see wave after wave after wave of humans, and it's like it almost. I find it terrifying, because I am introverted, like people drain me, even though I've got an extrovert skill set, but standing there is genuinely, like, it's a religious experience. It is glorious, it is ugly, it is nauseating, it makes me want to cry for help, but there's also a deep beauty in it, because it's, just these wave after, and it's like the ocean, it just comes in wave after wave after wave. I think I find that almost more striking than the actual ocean, in a sense, like more it impacts me, and partly because of my personality, and like I said, it has me teetering towards panic attack, but then that makes me just go, man, God, like, just all the theological stuff that we know, and God loves humans, like the cross, I find that overwhelming and beautiful and ugly and terrifying and all the things.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out for me on that is being on the Thames. So whether that's like just being on like a riverboat, or I sometimes sail on the Thames, and it's, London is so full of human endeavor, in the architecture, in the people going over the bridges. It's so full of trying to do stuff and building the Houses of Parliament and building this building and so on. And then when you're on the Thames, and it's like either sparkling in the sun or not, or raining, whatever, I love how it slices through the city and slices through that. And I think that it's very humbling, that they have to keep dealing with the walls, and then we've squeezed, it used to be a swamp over by Tate Britain, but then they've squeezed it. And so it kind of makes a slightly angry river, and it's just going to keep coming in and keep going out with the rhythms and the birds and so on. And even though it was really, really dirty until very, very recently, it's starting to revive, and it's kind of like cleaned itself. I find that being on the water is a beautiful thing, and it's this great contrast to the rest of the city. and humbling, like it gives you a different perspective right from the center of the city of all this, our kind of, our silliness sometimes of what we're trying. And I mean, I don't mean silliness, because I think people are wonderful and what they do is great. But I think it puts things into an interesting perspective and brings in a bit of humility and awe, but like right in the center of the city.
Yeah, and it's with the Thames, I'm always I think I used to be quite scared of it, just the kind of immensity of it. I think having grown up by the Great Lakes, I was like, oh, well, those are basically oceans. I know how to deal with them. I know how to swim in them. But here's this river I can't swim in because it's dirty. And there's boats going in and there's bridges and I don't know how to relate to this. Is this part of the city or is this nature? And of course, it's a bit of nature which has been in relationship, increasingly intense relationship with the humans since Londinium and before.
Yeah.
So, speaking of hybridity, it occupies this kind of this in-between space as this wholly natural thing, which is tidal, and yet is so, we're so dependent on it and it's so reactive to what we try to do to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't really care about us.
No. Yeah. I've read a couple books at least where it was a kind of main character of the book, which I appreciate, that kind of anthropomorphism. But
yeah, nice.
I'm just looking at the time. We're getting on to 2:45. So what I'm going to do now is just read a little excerpt. I'll kind of jump around a bit. And Meredith and Dumaeza, feel free to pick up on stuff when I've finished there that you want to comment on. And everybody else on the call, that invitation is very much open to you as well. If there's something that we've been talking about so far that you want to ask a question about or make a comment about, or something that comes up when I'm reading, now is your time to shine. So this is an excerpt from chapter 2 of Sacred Pavement. In the first chapter, well, in the staging chapter, I set the scene about what we're doing. And in the first chapter, I write about walking. Now, I know that walking and urban walking is something that the Heart Edge Network has been doing a lot of. Kath, is it Richard Carter who does the contemplative walks?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So some of you on this call may have been doing, watching some of those walks. And I imagine all of us during COVID have been taking a few more walks than normal. And that may have become part of your prayerful or contemplative practice. So moving on from there, I go to reading architecture. When city dwellers look around them at architectural styles, many of them seem to have a bad reaction, to the architecture of the 20th century, especially that of the 1960s. Look at that hideous mid-century tower block. Didn't they have any other materials beside concrete? Everything built after 1930s is basically an eyesore. We should just bulldoze a lot of them and make way for better. Now, those last four things were all, though you couldn't see them, all in air quotes. And I deliberately put them in air quotes because they are comments that I overheard on an architecture tour of a central London housing estate during the Open House Festival a few years ago. And I found myself keeping very quiet on this tour because I've always had a soft spot for architecture of the 1960s, whether it's properly brutalist or not. Brutalism refers to a particularly simple or even stark style of architecture popular during the 1960s and 70s that uses a lot of exposed steel and béton brut, French for unadorned concrete. It's a style people love to hate. It doesn't offer a lot of comfort or charm in the traditional sense. And as with all styles, there are good and bad examples of it. Plenty of apartment blocks which are just pretty awful, dreadful, gray monsters. What endears me to this period in history generally, and the buildings that it produced in particular, is that so much of it was optimistic to the point of being naive. So many of these high rises and pedways, which are now derided as ugly were intended to create something like utopian cities in the sky. If you look at Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier, one of the most famous designers of this era, his tower blocks were devised to include not only comfortable, functional apartments, but also shops and restaurants and communal spaces, and often a school nearby. Now, of course, no utopian ideal is without its critics. If you want a scathing attack on this era or the social progress that these buildings were intended to relate, read Ballard's High Rise. But what do we do with these buildings around us that divide opinion? What do we do with the architecture which some relate to as beautiful and some relate to as ugly? One way in which I think we can relate to our built environment as a spiritual practice is in how we allow it to nudge us towards wonder. In one of my favorite poems by the poet Denise Levertov, Primary Wonder, Levertov marvels that it is possible for us to forget the quiet mystery that there is anything at all, and that this anything is held in being by a creator or a hallowed one. But it is possible, isn't it? And it's occasionally even quite fashionable to forget quiet mystery. In the city, learning to read the buildings around us as a spiritual practice is part of nurturing this wonder into our daily concrete realities, rather than having to get out of the city and wait for a wilderness to nudge us in this direction. Levertov's poem challenges our human tendency to forget that every moment we live is a spiritual experience. We are beings of spirit, after all. We are only ever a breath away from that natural impulse to say wow to the miracle of existence and what we encounter in it. A colleague of mine helped me think more deeply about encountering beauty in the buildings around us when we were on our way to a meeting together one day. We were walking through what, to my mind, was a very ugly council estate, not even kind of nicely brutalist, truly East London council estate. And we were taking a shortcut on our way to this meeting. And he said, let's go through the estate this way and I'll show you where I'd love to stage a production of Romeo and Juliet. A former actor, he has a keen eye for performance and a sharp spatial awareness. The courtyard he showed me was this red brick Art Deco block of flats, each main door accessed by a short staircase and a little balcony. And in a flash, I could see Juliet peeping out from the door, sighing, while Romeo pined on audience level down in the car park. My colleague pointed out where he thought the sword fights could happen, the lover's flight, the death scene. It was such a joy to watch him delight in this simple and, I had assessed, ugly council estate, which he thought beautiful enough for Shakespeare. And the wonder in his voice was unmistakable. Now, it's one thing, as Dumaeza and Meredith and I were saying, it's one thing to feel wonder when appreciating beauty, but it's another thing altogether, although I'd say just as crucial to the spiritual life, to grapple with what strikes us as ugly or just plain boring. For example, returning to my love of brutalism, I'm under no false ideas that everything made of exposed rough concrete is beautiful. On a recent trip to Margate, I was reminded of this walking by Arlington House. If you've been there, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's tall and unkempt and uninspired and faces directly onto the sea, and it really offended my sensibilities, and I did not find it beautiful. I did not feel a sense of wonder, except perhaps to wonder who on earth had given planning permission for it to be built. So without this sense of beauty, can we include this experience in the realm of wonder or spirituality? I think we can and we must. Wonder at beautiful things is not the sum total of the spiritual journey, after all, although it might be an easy way in. Growing into spiritual maturity means slowly and sometimes painstakingly realizing that everything belongs in the spiritual life, not just our literal or metaphorical mountaintop experiences of beauty when we're bowled over by something pleasant around us or something that stirs up gratitude or joy. A spirituality which is limited to these kind of nice things, good vibes, love and light, only repeats this old escapist dilemma, which I wrote this book to try to address. It's the dilemma which many people of faith and spirituality find themselves in, the dilemma of only feeling able to inhabit your spirituality in good times, or by conjuring something like those good times to escape the negative or the difficult stuff. When we find ourselves facing this dilemma, the ugly buildings in our urban environments are our teachers. Ugly buildings teach us by offending us. Often our physical reactions to things we find unlovely are more precise and easier to describe than when we encounter beauty. Experiencing that cringe or disgust may not be pleasant. It may not be a place we want to spend a lot of time, but it is honest. In our spiritual lives, it can be incredibly easy to be dishonest with ourselves, what we think we like, want, or need, what guidance we receive, what we might be avoiding. Learning this honesty can be slow spiritual work, and the process of understanding our gut reactions to what we find ugly in our cityscape is part of keeping us honest. So that was me having just a bit of a thoughtful ramble about relating to what is ugly or boring or confusing around me, which provided a space for me to react to that stuff in myself and keep honest. So I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat. Kath, if there are people waiting to ask questions, you'll just give me a little nudge, or maybe I should be asking Ben to do this.
We have one already. If you're ready
Excellent.
to move to the questions.
Yeah.
Well, we can come back to Meredith. It looks like she's poised to speak as well.
Oh, okay. Meredith wants to chat.
To Sarah in a moment. Yeah. I think it's good to go to Meredith first.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, because I thought you were inviting a bit of comment afterwards, but this, and we even mentioned this about this relationship between beauty and ugliness before when Dumaeza was speaking, and our capacity to encounter what we think is ugly can be something that's so transformative for us. Like you look at very, very famous paintings, for instance, old paintings, Renaissance paintings, or whatever, going back, and the depiction, there are, countless depictions of ugly things happening, of people being killed, of ugly stuff. But because of the way that they're captured, we give it our attention and we sit and we look at it. And what that does for us in terms of how it builds our capacity to what we're willing to see in others, in our society, in ourselves, I think is a huge, huge gift. So I just love what you shared there, Erin, and, not just the love and light sort of stuff, and not that kind of spiritual bypassing kinds of things, but these encounters with things that we wouldn't necessarily choose, neighbors we didn't necessarily want, and whatever, and the quality of how we meet that is this, I think, an amazing invitation for us on a spiritual level, to expand what we're willing to accept, what we're willing to have compassion for, because really until we can sort of accept something, it's very difficult to change it or shift it or indeed hold compassion for it. So I like that. And churches, I think, in London have become places where you can really encounter diversity. So it's very easy in certain parts of London to only encounter people from the same sort of socioeconomic strata. And I know our church next door, my husband is a vicar at St. Etheldreda's here in Fulham. We have this beautiful salad of people, and you sit down and look at, the MP, the single mom, the this, you know, this real variety, and how the church is able to hold space for those encounters, I think is very, very precious. Not just encountering them, but actually people building relationships and connections and getting to know each other and seeing each other regularly. I think that's a lovely thing to do. But thank you, Erin. I really like that.
Thank you.
I was really struck by the honesty that you, like the word honesty, you said that a couple of times. And I feel like it's a question, I suppose, or like a provocation. I don't know. And I'm not on the outside of this, I'm asking this of myself and of us. I wonder how honest churches are in our, I don't know, just engagement and paying attention to stuff around us, to humans ultimately around us. And I can't say with confidence that we are honest about ourselves, about our privilege, about our wealth, about our, you know, the resources that we have and how we leverage or don't leverage them, about our acts of service, about the food bank, or, you know, and all those are good things. But yeah, just so I was just struck by the honesty and yeah. Sorry.
I think honesty, it can be easy to feel like we know our motives and we know why we engage with people who are like us or different to us or do things inside or outside of church. Be like, yeah, we know why we're doing this. We're really honest. We want to reach across these things of difference. But so often it's in that encounter that we realize, oh, were we as honest as we really thought? And I think you both have kind of touched on that. It's honesty comes not only as we sort of get to know ourselves deeper, but as we get to know, as we encounter the other deeper, isn't it? You know,
and it's a practice, just like our spiritual practice. It's being honest with this moment, and then being honest with the next moment, and being honest with this emotion, and keeping on practicing it. You never get to a fixed place where you've got it all figured out and you're doing the right thing, because what was the right thing to do 10 years ago or 10 days ago or whatever, it will be different now. It might not be the right thing or the most loving thing to do now.
The thing about cities, isn't it? Because they're always constantly changing. That's why our spirits are constantly stretched and inspired along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. Shall we move to some of the questions coming through? Some fascinating questions are coming through in the chat. Thank you, folks. I'm sure this can be a discussion amongst the three of you. But if we turn first to Sarah Batts-Neal, lovely to have you with us, Sarah. For your question, if you could just unmute yourself, that would be wonderful.
Hello. So asking for a friend, really. I was interested in the way that planning can support spirituality. What would you teach urban planners about supporting our spirituality in those spaces that are perhaps ugly and difficult to live in?
Do our urban planners get a magic wand?
Yeah. And unlimited money.
Nice. I want to be an urban planner now.
I don't.
I think when you were asking that question, Sarah, I was thinking about all of the kind of anti-homelessness things which have been planned into our city spaces recently. And I think that to me just reflects a kind of the opposite of how I'd want to answer that question. I'd want to encourage planners to be kind of radically compassionate with what they pour into creating spaces. It might be less convenient to their clients, but I wonder about, what compassion looks like in kind of concrete and steel. But others feel free to jump in. I don't have to be the one to answer these.
Well, wouldn't it be cool if you could build stuff that was really easy to tear down and change, you know, so that people could be more, it was less fixed, and it could be destroyed and rebuilt with the same materials with some sort of environmental concern. So you have these moments to keep redefining and keep redefining.
Yeah, I was along your lines, Erin. I was just kind of thinking, like, there's, you know, without going as far as city, like building new stuff, the stuff that's already there, we can, there's ways and means to make what we already have far more hospitable, like, for example, to the homeless or whatever. But we choose, like the collective, all of us, we choose to not do that. But it's also because there's a cost, right? And I wonder, like, if every bus stop was actually made into a bed so that a homeless person could sleep and be sheltered, like that, there's a cost to that, to me and my family and I wonder, like, we like the idea of like more hospitable cities, but like, are we, me and my kids and your aunt and your nan, are we willing, is that honesty again, and it's a question, I don't know, like, are we willing to bear the cost of making our cities hospitable, of making the bus shelter, actually it can be somebody's shelter, and that means you need to adjust and adapt, and what your expectations of comfort and what that space is or ought to be to you. So it's an interesting one that kind of indicts us almost as the more privileged inhabitants of the bus stop or the whatever. It's like, no, this is actually the way the hostile planning is quite convenient, like somebody else has said, for me and my wife and kids, and for it to be more hospitable to somebody would cost me and us.
And no more cul-de-sacs. None of that estate cul-de-sac nonsense. That would be a good one.
Meredith, when you were talking about things that could be sort of erected and dismantled, I was thinking of how much, when I see kind of new high rises going up, I'm a bit like, oh man, like, aren't they just going to tear that down in 20 years? You know, and part of me is just still really brick guile. Like, oh, I, you know, having not come from a place where people build with brick, going over here, be like, oh, it's so beautiful that they built with brick. But of course, something about contemporary architecture, at least in some arenas, is meant to be about that kind of, we could take this down in a little while if it's not working. Whether or not that is anything more than a PR exercise, of course, is another matter altogether, just to get up some cheap flats that we can get investment capital in. But anyways, we'll go on about that a long time.
Yeah.
Great joy that it's really popular at the moment. I've seen it in Truro, is to have, in any wild spaces, roundabouts, is to have totally wild flowers, you know, poppies. So, you know, that desire to reclaim the wild in the midst of the city, it just moves me to tears. I mean, it just looks so beautiful in the midst of urban concrete. And that's a kind of an intentional urban planner's decision.
Yeah, rewilding. Yeah.
But anyway, moving on. I mean, I'm absolutely delighted that Molly has named something that is on our hearts very intensely today with the news of Sarah Everard, you know, that cities can be really dangerous, really frightening places for all of us, particularly at times women. And our thoughts go out to Sarah's family today, of course. But Molly, would you like to just expand a bit more about your point, because it's a really valid one?
Yeah, sure. I was wondering about exactly that. How do we learn to inhabit and love and do that kind of visio divina of looking at the city and incorporating it into our spirituality, while holding in tension this kind of sense of how it can be a space that's threatening? And often I mean, that's not inherent to the city itself. Obviously, there are so many social and you know, constructs that mean that that's the case. And I guess it's a question of how do we hold those things in balance? How do we do justice in that space? Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what the three of you think.
I think experiencing fear is can really teach you a lot about what other people are experiencing in other parts of the world. And yeah, it's not nice that we don't always feel safe. And I don't really have a perfect answer for how to make cities perfectly sort of safe. I'm sure, you know, there are people with jobs that know better than I would about that, but just on the spiritual dimension of living in a city and what fear can teach us. Again, I think that that's something that can teach a lot of compassion, because being afraid and feeling insecure, we live in a very secure place. You know, looking at the rest of the world, we're pretty lucky. And there are a lot of places that don't feel like that. And it stretches us to feel for those people and also understand what kind of strength and resilience we need in our own faith when we're under restrictions and feeling restricted, like pandemic kind of stuff, like that kind of, it feels like you're living under a lid and not being able to do things. But there are people that have similar experiences to that all over, you know, that are alive now and have been alive throughout the ages. And so I guess my perspective on that is more that that's a human experience, and it can help us to understand other people more. And I keep saying compassion. I got compassion on the brain today, but would help us to understand what other people feel like in other places. And perhaps that would motivate us to act slightly differently in some ways, or even pray for them or what have you.
I was thinking about the first time I got mugged, which happened, Molly, you will know where Spitalfield City Farm is. Just kind of just over the railway tracks that way. And yeah, I was, when you were asking your question, I was thinking about how did I reclaim that street, Buxton Street, after that happened to me. And like you know, it was a mugging. I wasn't sexually assaulted, so it was quite, you know, different to many potential experiences that could have happened, but still really, really terrifying and awful. And how did I reclaim that? I think by making space for some anger about it and making some space to be back there with people who witnessed my fear and my anger. And also seeing it as a wider issue than this kind of one thing that happened to me that one time because some stupid kid wanted my very, very crappy mobile phone. You know, that was a moment of a crime happening, but also, as we've seen in the last day and a bit, you know, it's also about bigger things in our culture around what the patriarchy asks of people who are more vulnerable, in this case, especially of women walking alone in the streets at any time of day. So I think I reclaimed that by trying to make this link with my own reckoning and also the link with the bigger justice issues that are related to that around, you know, I had a police officer telling me, well, you probably shouldn't walk down that street at 8 at night in a summer evening, you know. And that's again been a lot in the news in the last day, is how do people who we trust to be involved in protection wind up doing that blaming stuff. So again, just making the justice link bigger was part of me reclaiming that space. I also think, come on, Britain, like, why can't people carry pepper spray? But that's a whole can of worms that I'm not going to get to as an American. Draw a line onto that. Dumaeza, do you want to say something about this?
I wonder if Alison Wilson could just come in at this point, because she's made a comment on this as well. Alison, would you like to speak?
Oh, yes. What are you asking me particularly about what I've said?
Yeah, did you want to make a comment?
I'm not trying to undermine anybody else's experiences, and I'm not comparing being mugged or being murdered with eating some poisonous berries. That is not what I mean by this comment. But really, I'm just meaning that whatever our experience, we're all influenced by our upbringing, in ways that we realize and ways that we don't realize, and that wherever we are, whether we've been in the same place all our lives, or like the people we've been listening to have traveled around the world, there are multiple influences on us from all the places, the people, the cultures that we encounter. And wherever God has placed us is special, because it's where he's placed us, and because we are to be salt and light wherever we are in a dark world. And the comment that I made about the city motto, there are probably thousands of people in Glasgow now who don't know the original motto. They only know the 3 words, "Let Glasgow flourish," if you're lucky. But what makes a city flourish? Well, for those of us who are Christians, a big part of any city flourishing is what's happening in the churches in it, and outside of the church buildings, what the church folk are doing in their city and influencing throughout it, all the networks of communication of different people in different workplaces, different encounters with neighbours and strangers within each place, whether it be village, city, whatever.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
I wonder if we could go to Ryan Lynch now for your question, your love of Mile End. The ugly green bridge over Mile End. Do
I
unmute
just
yourself.
saying, like, I don't know if people know the Green Bridge over Mile End. For me, it's an ugly structure. Just saying that I was born in East London, and so listening to Meredith and Dumaeza, Erin talk about their travels and their fun in East London home, say welcome. But my question and my thinking was about the permanence and impermanence of cities. So I was thinking of all the cities that were once political, social, economic centre of life that now are only tourist attractions, Athens, Rome, Machu all those kind of places that were once seen permanent, but now they're not. And when I go to the Mile End Bridge and I look up Mile End Road to the east in the early morning, you can see the sun rising. And if you go there in the evening and look to the west down Mile End Road, you'll see the sun setting. And for me, it's the contrast between cities not being places of permanence, that all rise and all decline. Look over in history, you go to the Colosseum in Rome, you know, they seem so permanent, but they're not. And contrast that with the sun rising and setting as something permanent, you know, and how do we experience spirituality in places like cities that aren't permanent? You know, they may seem permanent, they're not permanent, they're always on the decline, always. And they can't last, they're not built to last. As I said, most of them, a lot of famous ones are tourist attractions. How do we experience the permanent in the impermanent of the cities around us? Is my question.
Yeah. There's something. We've touched on this a couple different times, but I really hear you, Ryan, with that sense of cities are quite arrogant and like hubristic places, aren't they? It's just like, look at these amazing things that people have made, you know, whether that's, as Meredith's been saying, you know, about the art that we see in museums, or whether it's the built environment. We like to get ahead of ourselves and be like, this is going to be around forever. And you just have to go to see some ancient ruins or read Ozymandias, the poem, and be like, maybe not. And I guess to me, I mean, there's a big thing in there about realizing, well, this body is not permanent either. You know, I have certain beliefs about being clothed upon with immortality in the next life, but I think it's going to look a bit different than this. So it's something about impermanence outside us, maybe making it easier for us to reconcile with the impermanence that is within us. I don't know, that's the first thing that brought to mind. And when it comes to the experience of the last 12 months, certainly the amount of fear, fear of sickness, fear of death, fear of prolonged suffering that's been around in our lives and in our social media, it's sort of driven home that point as well, hasn't it? This sort of sense of having to reckon with impermanence and mortality in a way that maybe when we're not in a pandemic, it's easier for some of us, although not many of us, to avoid reckoning with some of those fears that are always there, but perhaps in cities which move really fast and tend to attract people who are, you know, in their first couple of jobs post-uni and are living the fast life, maybe it tends to glorify some of this feelings of impermanence, which ultimately are going to get taken away from all of us, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
But I quite like the Mile End Bridge. I don't hate the Mile End Bridge.
It's green and plastic.
Yeah.
Thinking, I don't think David Attenborough would like that much plastic.
Wonderful. It's just that cities are just interpreted so differently by each one of us. That's good. We have a couple more questions if we can squeeze them in the last 5 minutes, if that's okay. I'd like to go to Simon Cartwright now, who really picked up on this idea of hybridity. And I just love both of you, both Meredith and Dumaeza, you were saying about, you know, our curiosity increases with the increase in hybridity.
Thanks, and thanks for today. Thanks for your input. It's been really interesting and fascinating, and enjoying it immensely. I don't know if you've come across the whole concept of hybrid space, of the idea of third space thinking. Christopher Baker's written about. I really like that concept of a hybrid space, of a third space, not your space being your homework space, but not your working space, but the third space where you encounter others. And where the encounter takes place, whether that be a coffee shop or whether that be a fountain place around in a shopping centre, may even be a church. But one of the things that Chris Baker talks about is curating those spaces. And I was really taken by the analogy of museums and art galleries that you've mentioned, Meredith, and that concept of whether is there a possibility we could create hybrid spaces? How do we facilitate community? I was talking to a head teacher yesterday who was saying we spent 2 years telling our children not to connect with one another. And how do we create a place to allow a relationship to actually happen? It's going to be something we need to teach people anew and afresh. I just wanted to reflect perhaps on curating hybrid space.
Yeah, I think that my previous work has included curating art in the public realm, and this is a topic that I think is so interesting, and we absolutely can do that. How that process actually works in real life with respect to, and I have been in this sort of Bermuda triangulation between like an artist, a developer, and the local counselor, but so it's tricky because public space, if it's too poorly defined, then it becomes difficult, but you just want to stamp as a little bit of definition on it so that then people will start to interpret and use it. And also the way that people use space changes so much. So, you know, where a farmer's market might have been like the perfect answer a few years ago or something, now people being able to eat outside or you know, benches in for picnicking or something is really important. But I think that there's a huge endeavor to try to do that, but it's not an easy field to be in when you have spaces that you're trying to appeal and work for lots and lots of different stakeholders. And then you start talking about drainage and everything becomes a lot of hard paving and it becomes very hard and there aren't enough trees. And so no one really wants to hang out there. It's a very delicate balance. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we should stop pursuing this kind of utopic idea and keep redefining it and keep redoing. I mean, that the idea of the shared space in front of the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, where it's pedestrians and cars, there's not as much definition, is quite radical in terms of like not just making cars the most important thing, that people have to make allowances for cars. So I think there's a million different ways that we can do this. I do think that sort of does happen. And ultimately, I think people attract people. And so if you create a space that's nice to be in and is kind of calming and it's not too open, not too much hard landscaping, it does sort of get used. And people do like it.
I was thinking about hybridity, like as you both were talking about it. It's not like we were talking about hybridity as this sort of mushy middle, is it? Hybridity is you got to be a thing, and you've got to be two things in order to be able to exist in this hybrid space. And you both really alluded to that in different ways, talking about your story. And I think when it comes to this kind of third space thinking around churches, cafes, things like that, hybrid spaces have to be authentically, they have to be able to draw from two things which people can identify as authentically those things. So Meredith, there are spaces which are car spaces and there are spaces which are people spaces, and you get this wonderful hybrid because people are able to go, whoa, they decided to make a thing that was both and privilege the people. And I think sometimes in our postmodernist like love affair with hybridity, we tend to forget that the work of those discrete identities has to be done before we get this like exciting, sexy hybridity. So there's something about that, about knowing what those specific spaces have to bring, that when the hybrid can then borrow from those, that's when it gets really exciting because people can notice that for what it brings as special. But I don't want to keep. I want Dumaeza to speak as well.
Oh yes.
I was the thing that came to mind was an accidental hybrid and third space that we've got outside. So I live above like a 300-year-old church building, and the church gardens are like they're public space, like everybody sits, and there's a group of secondary school Asian lads who hang out there's a bench almost opposite my front door, and there's a big tree and it's kind of shade, and it's been an interesting thing because they were there before I was, so that bench and that area, they see it as theirs. I don't know that they necessarily relate that space to the church. They see the church in front of them, but that's their bench, so they've got a sense of ownership, and so they occupy the space in a certain way. But something's happened because it's also clearly outside my front yard. Now that my house is my house and it's not their space, but this space, like it's our mutual ownership has done something beautiful with our relationship with each other and with the space, where because they own it, and I acknowledge that, and that requires and draws out a certain posture towards me, but also because I live here and I clearly own it, there's an accountability that happens and a robust respect. And I can call them out, and I have called them out because I'm like, I'm not telling you what to do, what not to do, but this space is all of ours, and I've got kids. So the thing that you were doing right there, like, is that a good idea? And they've responded again with like, a respect and, oh yeah, no, this is your space. It's also ours though, but so we're going to keep doing this. But, so I think ownership and that definition and a respect, I think, because I'm not asking them to move. I'm not expecting them to move, but neither am I. And so we were working out how to inhabit and embody this space in a way that's mutually flourishing. And it requires me to shift a little and get over some stuff, but it requires them to shift a little and get over some stuff. And so we do this dance, everybody embodies and owns and holds each other to account, and sometimes there's friction, and you end up with this mutually flourishing space. But it's a robust space. That's not a mushy middle. Sometimes it's a hang on now. That we're not all flourishing when you're flourishing in that way. So, you know.
Brilliant example. Thank you, Dumaeza. I would just like to go to Dean for last of all. I don't think there'll be much time to actually comment on your question, but I do ask your question, make your comment, Dean. It would be great to hear it. Over to you.
Great. I just wanted to say thank you to your contributors. I think it's important to mention about how we engage our 5 senses in relation to the city. We are complete humans, and people relate to cities with their sights, their smells, the different stuff. I'm always reminded about what music I can hear in a city coming from cars. I'm reminded of how people walk and where they walk. And the final thing I want to say is no city is neutral. It is contested space. There are powers, principalities at work and forces that we just need to acknowledge. So I just want to say to us all that it's not a neutral thing. It's not, calm, but there is rumbling, as Brené Brown would put it. Any comment on that?
I love that. I love the way that you put it, that sort of that contested thing, that there's sort of, risk and threat and opportunity, and that we encounter all that like in our bodies. And yeah, I think that was figuring out a way to encounter that was a big part of like why I started writing this book, and why it's a DIY guide with a lot of like, okay, like try this thing, like create your own maps and engage with this, and in a physical map way, but also create this inner map which helps you navigate with your body and with your senses. And I just, really well put. Thanks, Dean.
Well, folks, this has been so rich. We could just keep going on for another hour. There's so much more to share, but a huge thanks on behalf of everybody to Erin for writing this book, which is available to buy now, although it won't come to you until the 25th of March. Is that correct, Erin? It's you can order it for £10. That's with Amazon, or you can go to more ethical places to buy it, and it will be with you by the end of the month. Meredith and Dumaeza, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your skill, your passion. It's really enriched this session. Thank you for your time today. And Erin did mention that the Nazareth Contemplative Walks on the Facebook page of St. Martin in the Fields. This is every Saturday at 8 o'clock, 8 till 8:45. We walk through a different London park, and we share prayers, contemplative words, and they've just really been hugely popular. This taking church out into the outdoors and into the neighborhood. A good thing to look up if you're interested in that. But thank you to each one of you for joining us today as well, and do buy the book. It is officially launched. Thank you, Erin.
There we go. Duly launched. I've launched it. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining. I'm not going to say thank you a gazillion more times, but deep thank you. It's been a joy to have these conversations with you. It's been really, really fun.